Together. So what are we talking about when we're talking about manuscript evidence? First and foremost, be aware of the fact that Muslims are talking about Muslims and Christians are talking about two different things if we're talking about manuscript evidence. For the Muslim, they assume that everything that is in this book is not only was it sent down to a man named Muhammad over 22 years, but that it is written on eternal tablets that exist in heaven. Eternal tablets that exist in heaven, right? So when they're talking about the Quran, it's not something that was created. It was not something that was created by man. It was not something that was written down by man. It has always been. Chapter 85, verse 22 in the Quran is very clear that this book always existed eternally, coexisting with God, which is shirk in and of itself, is it not? Yes. That's committing the law of shirk. You cannot equate anything or anybody with God except God. So what are they doing with an eternal tablet? I let the Muslims try to deal with that. It's so good. They just bring it up. Now already you can see there's duality built into chapter 85, verse 22. Nonetheless, what they would say was sent down to Muhammad over a 22-year period. It was not written in that 22-year period. What, you know, you have to ask and think. The one thing that Muhammad was supposed to do, the one thing that he was given to do was to not to receive the Quran, but to get it written down, correct? How could he could not even do what God, the remit that God had given to him? In 22 years, he did not write the Quran. Well, the answer Muslims always come back to me is because he could not read and write. Yes, okay. It took 22 years. Don't you think you could have learned to read and write? Listen, I took 2 years of Arabic. I learned to read and write Arabic in 2 weeks. Read and write, not understand it, read and write it. It doesn't take long to read. There's only 28 letters in the Arabic alphabet. It doesn't take long to read and write it, to understand the vowelization. Anybody here can do it in 2 weeks. He had 22 years. He already understood Arabic, did he not? He grew up with it. How could he not learn to read and write in 2 weeks? 22 years. On top of that, he had a scribe, a secretary named Zayd ibn Thabit. What do secretaries do? That's their job, right? So why didn't he write it down? He had 22 years to write it down. When he finally did write it down in 632 to 633, under the time of Abu Bakr and Umar, that was given to one of the wives of Muhammad. She put it under her bed for 20 years. 20 years later, when they pulled it out again, because there were so many, a multiplicity of Qurans, remember that, Uthman, the time of Uthman, 652, roughly 20 years later, they then had to write it again. Why did they have to rewrite it again if it's already written? Because it was not written in the right dialect. Hold on a minute. Wow. The right dialect, by definition, if you know Arabic, the dialect for Arabic, you need to have the dhamma, the kasra, and the fatha. You need to have the vowelization. There were no vowelizations in the 7th century. In fact, Arabic was so crude, it could not be read. Why would God, in His wisdom, choose Arabic for His final revelation, when He already had Greek and Hebrew to go with? I love to ask, I've asked Muslims that, why in God's wisdom would He choose the language that couldn't even accommodate His revelation? Wow. And then on top of that, why would He choose a man who could read and write to give it to? I'd love to ask God that. Well, it's obviously that there's a problem here. When he finally, Uthman finally had Zayd ibn Thabit along with Zubair, Alas, and Hadith rewrite this Quran, this second Quran, he then had one copy of that sent to 9 different cities. Every province in that land is what it says. Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Alexandria, Aden, Hera, and Nishabur. Which means we should have 9 of them today. Right? 9 Qurans. 9 original manuscripts. All from the time of Uthman. Show me one. Show me one. Does anybody know of any manuscript from the 7th century? You want to raise your hand? Okay, where?
The Book of Mormon, maybe.
Where does this man come from? Did Mormon live, the Book of Mormon, did Joseph, my name is Joseph Smith, by the way, so be careful. And I'm a junior as well, Joseph Smith and Junior. I have a great time in the Speaker's Corner. The Muslims come up to me and they say, we want to shake your hand. I said, you better careful, we're going to hammer your Quran, your Book of Mormon next. You got the wrong century, but thanks anyhow. 7th century, there is no manuscript at all. We can't find even one manuscript. We cannot even find a partial manuscript. The earliest manuscripts, and here's what's great about it, when you do like with like, Muslims have always come up to us, and they'll come up to you and say, we have the original Quran. Have you heard them say that?
Yeah.
We have not just one. It used to be 100,000 of them. Then they brought it down to around 10,000 about 10 years ago. Then after the 2014 debate that I had with Shabidati, they brought it down to 6. And they realized that they only had 6 manuscripts, and that's the Topkapı manuscript, which is in the Topkapı Museum in Istanbul. That's the Samarkand manuscript, which is in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. That's the Husseini manuscript, which is in Cairo in Egypt. That's also the Metropolitanus manuscript, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, there in France. And then you have the Michael manuscript, which is in London. That's the one that we have. In fact, we were looking at it. I was just at it last month. I saw it last month. And then the most famous, probably the most exciting, would be the Sana'a manuscript, which is in Yemen. Those are the 6. That's it. That's all they've got. Now, one of them is from the 7th century. Not one of them actually is complete. They only begin to appear in the 8th century. Muhammad died in 632. The earliest they have is the Sana'a manuscript, which is the upper text of the Sana'a manuscript, and that's 705. But it even has additions that have been put into it. You saw, those who were here yesterday, you saw, we went from verse 19, it jumps to verse 22. What happened to verse 20 and 21? They're on the other side of the page, in a completely different script that was created another 60 to 70 years afterwards. So even within this 8th century, these are almost 2 ends of the 8th century, you get the Sana'a manuscript being put together. We looked at some of the carbon dating of the Sana'a manuscript. Remember the carbon dating results that we got from the Lyon lab and from the Kiel lab and from the Oxford lab, all these 4 labs in Europe? They dated the Sana'a manuscript, 4 different labs. The latest date, remember for carbon dating, they could go about 100 years in the datings. The latest datings for all those 4 labs of the Sana'a manuscript, the latest date was 550. Muhammad was born in 570. The Quran was started to be revealed in 610. Muhammad died in 632. This is almost 100 years before Muhammad was born. That means the Sana'a manuscript is not only before Muhammad, it's before Islam, and it's before Quran, and it's certainly before Uthman. Ooh, I love it. Makes my job so easy. So here they come up to us and they say, well, we've got 100,000 manuscripts. Okay, well, maybe it's only 6 manuscripts. And then they say these 6 manuscripts are complete. These 6 manuscripts are the same as each other, and there are no differences between those 6 manuscripts and the manuscript we have today, the Quran, this book that I have in my hand today. Folks, these are lies. Every one of these manuscripts, the Topkapı is the best, and that's now pretty much all they're now trying to defend. The one I'm going to be doing a debate in Hong Kong in November with Ijaz Ahmed. You know him? Ijaz Ahmed, anybody know that name? No. David, you know that name?
Yeah.
He's a whippersnapper, isn't he?
Yeah, he is.
He has no idea. The guy is not disciplined, but boy, he knows his material. I'm going to be debating him in Hong Kong on this manuscript. He will only debate on this manuscript because he's pretty well dismissed the Sana'a. He's pretty well dismissed the Mahil. He's pretty well dismissed all the other manuscripts because we have destroyed all of them. Now they're come down to only 1 manuscript. 2018, they only have 1 manuscript that they want to defend. Do you see how easy our job is getting? This is why I love this work. But I never had this 37 years ago, what we have now today. This is why it's getting so easy for all of you. You people are going to move in. You're going to go much quicker than we are because we're giving you the material. You can use it so much quicker. So there you got the Quranic manuscripts. You only have 6 of them. Not one of them they're willing to defend, but 1. And now we're going to destroy that in November. But because I cannot reveal you what we now know, I'm not permitted to do that until November. So you'll just have to wait. Because we now have the Topkapı. We've looked at it, and boy, what you won't believe what we have found in the Topkapı. Ooh, it's great stuff. So that's not till November. Now let's go back and let's ask the same question of the Bible. So what do we have? They say, you don't have any of your originals. No, well, we've always admitted that. Nobody would say we have our originals. And why don't we have our originals? Because every one of our originals were written on papyrus, which are interlocking leaves. Papyri only exist for about 100 years. So there was no way we could put them on anything else because nobody was wealthy enough to write them out in parchment or vellum, which just takes animal skins. That's hugely expensive. You have to be wealthy to use animal skins. That wasn't done until the 4th century, when you had Constantine, who was the emperor of the empire at that time. He then became a Christian, was converted to Christianity, and made it the national religion. The first thing he did was convene the Council of Nicaea in 325, and he commissioned 50 New Testaments to be written, to be created for the Council of Nicaea. So what do we have? Well, the best we've got is one of those that he commissioned, possibly two of those that he commissioned. The Sinaiticus, that's in the British Library. God bless the British. They steal everything and always keep it. You've got to come to London to see it. That's the only place you can see it. But there it is, the entire New Testament in full black and white. Well, actually, it's brown and white. But it's great to see that we have preserved it, written on parchment. See, he was wealthy enough to do that. And from the 4th century on, there was a proliferation of these manuscripts. So that today we have 230, either complete or partial, New Testament manuscripts that we can look at before the 6th century. 230 before the 6th century. Why am I saying that? Because this is all before the time of Islam. This is all before the time of Muhammad. We have 230 we can look at. If we can come up with 230 either complete or partial manuscripts of the New Testament alone from before the time of Muhammad, how is it that Islam can't even come up with one from the 7th century? Another 100 years later. And the 6 that they come up with from the 8th century, none of them are complete, not one of them agrees with each other, and not one of them agrees completely with this book. So when was this book put together? Anybody know the answer?
33 years ago.
1924. Thank you. You learned from yesterday. And what is the reason why we have a 1920? Why is this one from 1924? Who knows the reason?
To standardize for the schools.
To standardize for the high schools in Cairo. That was the reason. They needed to get one Quran that was the same all over the high schools in the city of Cairo in Egypt. So therefore, they commissioned a committee from Al-Azhar University there in Cairo to come together and choose which Quran they were going to use. Because there are 37 Qurans that they could have used at. We have now found 31 of them. We now possess 31. Founder Hatun Tash possesses 31 of them. That's just by going to the marketplaces in Jordan, Yemen, and in Morocco. That's it. We're probably going to forget the other 6. They do exist today. You can buy them. This was the reason they had to standardize the text, because already Hatun has found 60,000 differences between those 31 Qurans. All of them are in Arabic. These are not translations. These are modern Arabic Qurans. And every one of these differences are over 1,000 years old. All of these differences, all of these changes in the Quran were created in the 9th and 10th century. 1,000 years ago. They are not new. But have you heard this before? Has any Muslim ever admitted this to you? Remember what David said. The authorities know this, the people on the street do not. The authorities know everything I'm saying. Everything that I'm saying has been around for 1,000 years. We're the first ones to expose it. We're the first ones to show that these 60,000 differences are not minuscule differences. Yes, they are diacritical differences. That means they're differences in the dots. So you need to, Muslims always say, well, look at all the thousands of thousands, 400,000 manuscript variants in the Bible. Well, how is it they know about those 400,000? Who do you think discovered them? We did. And 100,000 are just one word. A quarter of them come from just one word that was added to the story of that upper room when it says for Jesus went into the upper room with the 12. Another scribe, another 100 years later, then put up 12 disciples. Put the words disciples there so you know what 12 they were talking about. That 100,000 manuscripts have come that now have disciples in it. That's a quarter of the 400,000 right there. Does that change the meaning of the verse? No, it actually helps it, doesn't it? Does it put a new doctrine in? No, absolutely not. That's the beauty of our manuscript variants. We all not only know where they are, we tell everybody where they are. In fact, we also say when there have been verses that have been taken out. Take a look at my Bible. I don't know if you have it in yours, but in my NIV, when you go to Mark chapter 16, verse 9 to 20, there's a line there warning the reader that those verses are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts. What are we saying? We're not sure if these are there because we don't have it in the earliest manuscripts. That's being honest, isn't it? That's being transparent, isn't it? John chapter 7 verse 53 to John 8 verse 11, the story of the woman caught in adultery. That verse, there's a line before and a line before and after saying these verses are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts. 1 John chapter 5 verse 7, we know that verse shouldn't be in our New Testament. That was added in the 16th century. And then it was, in the 15th century, and then became standardized by the King James Version in 1611. And And that's why anyone that has copied this King James Version will include verse 7 in there, which is the Trinitarian formula. It should not be there. It was never intended to be there. The whole context of the chapter does not include the Trinitarian formula. It should be that these three are in agreement on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood. Not the God, the Holy Spirit, the God, the Father, God, the Son, God, the Holy Spirit. That should not be there. We are aware of that. We've been aware of that since the 1800s. Dr. Carl Fander had a debate on that in 1854. This is not new. We have always been transparent about manuscripts. But see, not only do we have the manuscript evidence, we've also got the translations. Almost immediately, the Bible was meant to be read by everybody. This is not a book that you have to go back to the Greek to read. This is not a book that you have to go back to the Hebrew to read. It was not something where God could only speak one language. And like in the Quran, you can only read it in one language. It cannot be translated. In fact, this says the interpretation of the meaning of the Noble Quran, which means it cannot be understood except for Arabic, which suggests to me that the God behind this book can only speak one language, Arabic. And which suggests to me also that 85% of the world's Muslim population cannot even read their own book because they cannot read Arabic. Thank God anybody can read this book. Thank God my God can understand every language. And I can understand him in every language. And that's why we have this book in 2,500 languages. So that 93% of the world's population now have the Bible in their own tongue. Because our God can speak every language. He is universal. This is the universal God. This is the universal God. And you see why I keep it bigger? It's bigger for a reason. It is meant for more people. Now, let's continue on. Not only do we have the languages, almost immediately they were to translate. When you look at the translations, you will see quickly that the translations, we have almost, if you look at, we have the Latin translations, the Syriac translations, already we have them from the 2nd century. We have the Coptic, Armenian, and the Gothic translations from the 3rd and 4th century. We have Nubian, Georgian, and Ethiopic almost immediately, and that's why it's amazing that you can go so many translations. We have now 15,000 manuscripts from 11 different translations that we can now put our hands on. How come that the Muslims can't do that with this book? Because they don't believe that the book can be translated. They believe that God only speaks one language, Arabic. They have no idea that Arabic comes from the Nabatean script. There was no Arabic before the 4th century AD, which suggests to me that Allah did not exist before 4th century AD. Ooh, I love that. Put that under your hat. Now let's go on. We don't just have the manuscript evidence. We do have 5,300 Greek manuscripts. We have 10,000 Latin Vulgates. We have 9,000 in other languages. That means 24,000 manuscripts alone that we can look at. Now be careful, not all of them are early, as David said and also Vocab said. Only 230 of them predate the 6th century. And those are the most exciting. But it's more than that. We don't just have the manuscript evidence. We don't just have the 15,000 translations. We also have the lectionaries, 2,135 lectionaries from the 6th century alone. That's 100 years before Islam even began. And these are liturgy that was done in the churches there in the 6th century, which are still preserved today. And if you look at the lectionaries, which is outside the manuscript evidence, they exactly parallel the manuscript evidence, which predates it. So there's another set, that's a whole nother criteria, or a whole nother, what am I trying to say, what's the word I'm looking for, genre of documentary evidence. Well, so we have the manuscript evidence, 24,000 of them. We also have the lectionaries, 2,135 of them. We have the translations, 15,000 of them. And then we have the early church fathers' quotations. Ooh, I love these. Early church, aren't they great, the early church fathers? You know, they were up there, they were getting disputed right, left, and center by the Gnostics. They were coming up with all kinds of heresy in the church. And the early church fathers needed to defend against their attacks. But they did a very clever thing. Rather than just sit there and debate like we do, like David and I and Vocab do, we like to debate. That's our, we're just, because we love to yell, we love to talk. But they didn't debate this. They did not need to debate this. What they did is they wrote letters. And when they wrote the letters, they wrote to the different churches. And what they did is, rather than try to come up with philosophical ideas or try to come up with philosophical paradigms, they just reiterated Scripture. They just re-quoted verse after verse after verse of the Scriptures in those letters. Now, two men, Dr. David Dalrymple and Dr. John Burgon, two of them in the last century, the 20th century, two British scholars decided to try to find and amalgamate as many of these early church fathers' letters as they could. And they came up with 86,000 of these early church fathers' letters. 86,000. But many of them were late, so they wanted to find out how many of them were early. How many of them were before the Sinaiticus and the Alexandrinus and the Vaticanus. Those are the three metropolitan codices, the most famous ones. The Sinaiticus is one that was found in the St. Catherine's Monastery. That is the one that's in the British Library. Right next to it is the Vaticanus. I'm sorry, the Alexandrinus, which is from the 5th century. That's the Old and the New Testament. Those are complete. And then there in Rome, they have the Vaticanus. So they wanted to find out these early church fathers' quotations that predated the 4th century, predated all the manuscript evidence. And they came up with 36,000 of them. 36,000 of these that predated the 4th century. They wanted to find the book of John especially, because the book of John has the highest Christology. It's the one that the Muslims attack the most. It's the one that everybody attacks, because it's so clear that John wrote it after the other three Gospels. He wrote it much later. He did not want a sequential Gospel like the other three. It was a theological treatise against the Gnostic. It was a polemic against the Gnostics, and that's why he wanted it. And that's why when you read it, it's so important. It just really drives home that Jesus is God all the way through, over and over again. So they wanted to find out how many of these they could find, and guess what they found? They were able to reproduce the entire Gospel of John from before the 4th century, except for 11 verses. Which means you can throw away all the manuscripts, please don't. Which means you can throw away the 15,000 translations, the 235 lectionaries. You can throw all of them away and still just retain the early church fathers' quotations, and still you can reproduce most of the New Testament. A complete different genre from the manuscript, a complete different genre from the lectionaries, a complete different genre from the translations. That's how our Lord has preserved our Bible.
Amen.
Knowing that this was going to be the big battle for the 21st century. Can we say that this book is authoritative, folks? Are you convinced this book is greater?
Yes.
When you compare it with this book especially, goodness sakes, there's no comparisons. Come on home. We've got a bigger and a better book. Thank you. I have 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask you to leave early, and we'll come back to the Old Testament next.